The summer heat in Black Hollow, Georgia, was suffocating in ways that went beyond the physical. The air hung thick and motionless over the cotton fields, carrying with it the scent of magnolias mixed with something darker, something that seemed to seep from the very earth itself. It was August of 1829, and the Blackwood estate stood like a monument to old money and older sins, its white columns gleaming in the oppressive sun, while shadows gathered in every corner of its sprawling grounds. The plantation stretched across 3,000 acres of prime Georgia soil, purchased by Thomas Blackwood's grandfather in the years following the Revolution with money made from rice and indigo. 3 generations of Blackwoods had built their fortune here, each adding to the grand house that now dominated the landscape like a Greek temple transported to the American South. The main house boasted 23 rooms, including a ballroom that had hosted governors and senators, a library containing over 2,000 volumes, and a wine cellar stocked with the finest imports from France and Spain. But for all its grandeur, there was something wrong about the Blackwood estate. The enslaved people who worked there knew it in their bones, felt it in the way the air seemed to grow colder as you approached the house, despite the suffocating heat everywhere else. They noticed how birds rarely sang in the trees closest to the mansion, how dogs would whimper and refuse to enter certain rooms, how even the mosquitoes that plagued the rest of Georgia seemed to avoid the third-floor windows. The white community of Black Hollow had their own suspicions, though they spoke of them only in whispers at church socials and town meetings. They noticed how Eleanor Blackwood never seemed to age, how her beauty remained constant year after year, while other women of her generation grew grey and lined. They remarked on the unusual number of servants who had run away from the estate over the years, always the young ones, always the healthy ones, disappearing in the night without a trace, despite the vigilant patrols and savage dogs that made escape virtually impossible. Eleanor Blackwood had been a widow for 3 years now, ever since her husband Thomas perished in what the town doctor ruled as a tragic accident involving his horse. The official story was that Thomas had been riding his prized stallion, Apollo, along the creek when the animal had spooked, throwing him against a tree. His neck had broken instantly, or so Dr. Hartley had determined after examining the body. The funeral had been appropriately grand, attended by everyone who mattered in Burke County society. But the official story satisfied only those who wanted to be satisfied. There were whispers in the slave quarters, murmurs that died on lips whenever the mistress drew near. The stable hands spoke quietly among themselves about how Apollo had been a gentle horse, steady and reliable, not prone to spooking. They noted how Thomas Blackwood had been an expert rider, having grown up on horseback. And they remembered that in the weeks before his death, he and Eleanor had been heard arguing, their voices carrying through the thin walls of the house, his accusatory, hers coldly defensive. One of the older house servants, a man named Isaac who had since run away, had whispered to others before his disappearance that he had seen scratches on the master's arms in the days before his death, deep ones that looked like they had come from fingernails rather than briars. He had seen the master drinking heavily, something he rarely did, and looking over his shoulder as if afraid in his own home. And he had seen the mistress watching her husband with eyes that held calculation rather than affection, studying him the way a cat studies a mouse before pouncing. At 42 years old, Eleanor possessed a beauty that seemed to defy time itself, her skin unnaturally smooth and pale, almost luminous in certain lights. Her eyes were the color of winter ice, sharp and calculating as a hawk's. Her hair, still the rich auburn it had been in her youth, showed not a single strand of grey. She moved through her mansion with the grace of someone who knew every floorboard, every shadow, every secret the house contained, and there were many secrets. The Blackwood estate was one of the largest plantations in Burke County, with over 300 souls working its fields and serving in its grand house. But it was the house servants who knew the truth, who saw what happened behind the locked doors of the mistress's private chambers on the third floor, who heard the screams that the thick walls couldn't quite muffle. It was these servants who had learned to walk with their eyes down, to speak only when spoken to pray in silence that they would not be summoned to the upper floors after nightfall. 16-year-old Patience had been born on the Blackwood estate, the daughter of field hands who had worked themselves to early graves in the scorching Georgia sun. Her mother, Ruth, had died of fever when Patience was 8, collapsing in the cotton fields on a day when the temperature had climbed past 100 degrees. Her father, Moses, had lasted until Patience turned 10, when his heart simply gave out during the harvest season, worn down by decades of brutal labor and insufficient food. Patience remembered him as a gentle man with strong hands and sad eyes, who would sing to her in the evenings about a promised land far away where people were free. She had been brought into the house at age 12, considered fortunate by some to escape the brutal labor of the cotton fields. The overseer, Malcolm Briggs, had noticed her during one of his inspections of the slave quarters, and something in her appearance, her light skin inherited from a white grandfather she would never know, her straight hair, her delicate features, had caught his attention. He had brought her to the mistress's notice, and Eleanor had examined her the way one might examine a piece of furniture, running cold fingers through her hair, tilting her face this way and that in the light, checking her teeth, her nails, her skin for blemishes. She'll do for housework, Eleanor had decided. Clean her up and teach her properly. I'll not have clumsy servants breaking my porcelain. And so Patience had begun her new life in the big house, working in the kitchen under the stern but not unkind watch of Mama Ruth. The older woman, who had taken the same name as Patience's dead mother by some strange coincidence, had 60 years of survival etched into her weathered face. She knew things, saw things, understood the dark currents that ran through the Blackwood estate. But she also knew when to speak and when to stay silent, when to act, and when to endure. Patience had learned quickly to be invisible, to anticipate needs before they were voiced, to exist as a ghost in the periphery of her mistress's vision. She learned which floorboards creaked and how to avoid them. She learned to read Eleanor's moods by the set of her shoulders, the tilt of her head, the way her fingers would drum against surfaces when she was contemplating something. She learned that there were rooms in the house that were never discussed, doors that were never opened, sounds that were never acknowledged, no matter how clearly everyone heard them. The third floor was forbidden territory. Servants cleaned the lower 2 floors with meticulous care, but the third floor belonged exclusively to the mistress. She kept the keys to those rooms on a ring that never left her person, and she ventured up there alone, sometimes for hours at a time. The other house servants had learned not to ask questions about what happened up there. The last girl who had asked too many questions, a curious young woman named Lily, had disappeared 3 months later, officially run away to seek her freedom in the north. But Lily had been terrified of the dark, had never shown any interest in escape, and had been planning to marry a young man who worked in the stables. Her disappearance had taught everyone an important lesson about the dangers of curiosity. But invisibility had its limits, and on this particular August morning, as Patience carried fresh linens up the servants' stairs, she made the mistake that would change everything. The stairs creaked beneath her feet, despite her careful tread, each sound seeming impossibly loud in the silent house. She had been assigned to deliver the linens to the mistress's chambers, a task she normally dreaded but could not refuse. The morning sun slanted through the tall windows, creating bars of light and shadow that felt like prison bars. The door to the mistress's chambers stood slightly ajar, unusual in itself, since Eleanor was meticulous about her privacy. Through that narrow opening, barely wider than Patience's hand, she glimpsed something that froze the blood in her veins. The large copper bathtub in the center of the room was filled with water that wasn't water at all. It was dark, thick, viscous in a way that water could never be, and unmistakably crimson. The morning light streaming through the windows made it gleam wetly, reflecting on the ceiling in patterns that looked like arterial spray, and in that horrific bath sat Eleanor Blackwood, completely naked, her pale skin glistening wet with the thick red liquid. Her head was tilted back, her eyes closed, her expression one of pure ecstasy. Her fingers trailed through the liquid lazily, lifting them to watch it drip back into the tub in thick rivulets. Her lips were slightly parted, and she was humming something, a melody that Patience didn't recognize, something old and strange and deeply wrong. The smell hit Patience then, wafting through the cracked door. It was metallic and organic all at once. The unmistakable smell of blood, gallons of it, fresh enough that it hadn't yet begun to clot or rot. The room was warm, kept heated by a fire despite the August temperature, and Patience could see steam rising from the blood, mixing with the morning light to create a hellish atmosphere. On a table beside the tub sat implements that made Patience's stomach turn. Surgical tools, gleaming and clean, glass vials filled with dark liquid, a journal open to a page covered in Eleanor's neat handwriting, and something else, something that made Patience's knees weaken. A bucket, still half full of blood, with a ladle resting in it. Eleanor had been pouring it over herself, bathing in it deliberately, luxuriating in it. The mistress's eyes were still closed, but her hands moved with purpose, rubbing the blood into her skin, her neck, her arms, as if it were the most expensive perfume from Paris. Her skin seemed to drink it in, seeming to grow more luminous, more youthful, with each passing moment. It was obscene. It was monstrous. It was beyond anything Patience's imagination could have conceived. Patience's gasp was barely audible. But in that silent house, it was enough. Eleanor's eyes snapped open, locking onto Patience with a predator's focus. The girl dropped the linens and ran, her bare feet slapping against the wooden floors as she fled down the stairs, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. She knew what she had seen. She knew, and worse, the mistress knew that she knew. That night, Patience huddled in the small room she shared with 3 other housegirls, her body trembling despite the stifling heat. The other girls whispered anxiously, having heard what happened, and Mama Ruth sat on the edge of Patience's narrow bed, her gnarled hand gripping the girl's shoulder with surprising strength. "You got to run, child," Mama Ruth whispered, her voice urgent and low. "Tonight, before she sends for you, before she decides what to do with what you've seen." "But where would I go?" Patience's voice cracked with fear. "They'd catch me before I got 5 miles. You know what they do to runaways." "Death by dogs is better than what she'll do to you," Mama Ruth said, and the certainty in her voice made Patience's stomach turn to ice. "There's things worse than dying, child. Things I've seen in this house that would make you pray for death." The old woman reached into the folds of her worn dress and pulled out a small cloth bundle. "This here's some bread and dried meat. There's a stream runs north behind the tobacco fields. You follow it until you reach the fork, then you go west. There's people out there, people who help folks like us get north. But you got to go now, while she's still deciding, while the house is quiet." Patience took the bundle with shaking hands. The other girls stared at her with wide, frightened eyes, knowing they couldn't help, knowing that to try would be to invite the same fate upon themselves. One of them, a girl named Sarah, who couldn't have been more than 14, pressed a small knife into Patience's palm, its blade dull but better than nothing. "God go with you," Sarah whispered. Patience slipped out through the kitchen door as the grandfather clock in the main hall struck midnight. The night was moonless, which was both blessing and curse. The darkness would hide her, but it also hid the roots and stones that threatened to trip her with every step. She moved as quickly as she dared across the lawn, past the rose garden where thorns caught at her thin dress, past the carriage house where the horses stirred restlessly in their stalls. She was almost to the edge of the property when she heard it. The sound of the front door opening with its familiar creak that somehow carried through the night air. The sound of footsteps on the veranda, measured and unhurried, the click of Eleanor's expensive shoes on the wooden boards, and then, cutting through the night air like a blade, Eleanor Blackwood's voice, calm and controlled and terrifying in its composure. Patience. Such an interesting name for someone so impatient to leave us. Come back, child. Let's discuss what you think you saw. There was a pause, and then Eleanor's voice came again, closer now, moving down the veranda steps. You can't really believe you'll make it, can you? A young girl, alone in the dark, in country you don't know. There are worse things in these Georgia woods than me, child. Things with teeth, things with claws, things that would do to you what I've only imagined. Another pause, and Patience could imagine Eleanor standing there, her pale face turned toward the darkness, those ice-cold eyes searching for any sign of movement. But if you come back now, willingly, I promise to be merciful. I won't hurt you. I'll simply ensure you never speak of what you saw. There are ways to do that without causing permanent harm. Come back, Patience. Come back and all will be forgiven. The lies dripped from Eleanor's mouth like honey, sweet and poisonous. Patience knew better than to believe a single word. She had seen the blood. She had seen the ecstasy on Eleanor's face as she bathed in it. There would be no mercy for someone who had witnessed that, only death, slow and terrible. Her blood drained drop by drop to fill that copper tub while Eleanor hummed her strange songs. Patience ran. She crashed through the underbrush, ignoring the branches that tore at her skin, the rocks that cut her feet, the thorns from wild roses that raked across her legs, leaving burning trails. The night pressed in around her, thick and suffocating, and every shadow seemed to hide predators both human and animal. She could hear Eleanor behind her now, calling out orders to wake the men, to ready the horses, to loose the dogs. The stream! She had to reach the stream. Dogs couldn't track through running water, everyone knew that. Her lungs burned and her legs screamed in protest, but she pushed harder, faster, branches whipping her face and body. And then, blessedly, she heard it, the gurgle of water over stones. She threw herself into the stream, gasping at the cold shock of it, and began wading upstream as fast as she could manage. The water came up to her thighs, dragging at her dress, threatening to pull her down. Behind her, the dogs reached the stream bank and began running back and forth, confused and agitated by the lost scent. But Patience's relief was short-lived. Through the trees came the glow of lanterns, and with them, men on horseback. She recognized the overseer, Malcolm Briggs, a cruel man with a face like weathered leather and eyes that held no mercy. And beside him, riding side-saddle on a magnificent black mare, was Eleanor Blackwood herself, dressed as if for a social call, despite the late hour. "The water won't save you, Patience," Eleanor called out, her voice carrying easily over the sound of the stream. "And even if it did, where would you go? Your property, child, valuable property that's just damaged itself trying to run. The punishment for that is severe. But if you come back now, willingly, perhaps we can discuss a more lenient arrangement." Patience kept moving, the water splashing around her, knowing that lenient was a word that held no truth in Eleanor Blackwood's mouth. She rounded a bend in the stream and saw it, a small wooden structure, little more than a shed, built on the bank. It was old and half-collapsed, probably used by hunters years ago and long abandoned. But it offered shelter, a place to hide until the sun rose and she could see where she was going. She pulled herself out of the water and crawled into the structure, pressing herself into the farthest corner, trying to control her breathing, trying to be silent despite the terror that made her want to scream. Through the gaps in the wooden walls, she could see the lantern light moving through the trees, hear the horses' hooves on the soft earth, hear the dogs still baying in confusion. "Find her," she heard Eleanor's voice, cold now, stripped of any pretense of civility. "I want her found before dawn. Search every inch of these woods." Hours passed. Patience remained frozen in her hiding spot, listening to the sounds of the search, watching the lantern lights weave through the darkness like malevolent fireflies. Her body ached from remaining motionless, her wet dress clinging to her skin, making her shiver despite the warm night air. She thought of Mama Ruth, of Sarah and the other girls back at the house. What would happen to them when Eleanor's anger needed an outlet and Patience wasn't there to receive it? As the first grey light of dawn began to filter through the trees, Patience heard something that made her heart stop. Footsteps. Not the heavy tread of the overseer or the other men. These were lighter, more careful, and they were coming directly toward the shed. The door, hanging crooked on its rusted hinges, was pulled open, and there, silhouetted against the growing light, stood Eleanor Blackwood, alone. She held no lantern now, needed none in the dawn light. In her hand was something that gleamed silver. A knife, long and curved, the kind used for cutting meat. "Did you really think you could hide from me?" Eleanor asked, her voice almost conversational. "In my woods? On my land? Everything here belongs to me, Patience. The trees, the water, the very air you're breathing, and you, most especially you." Patience pressed herself harder against the wall, but there was nowhere to go, no escape. Eleanor stepped into the shed, and in the dim light, Patience could see her face clearly for the first time. The mask of aristocratic beauty had slipped, revealing something underneath that was far more terrible. There was hunger in those eyes, a desperate, consuming need that went beyond simple cruelty. "Do you know why I do it?" Eleanor asked, moving closer, the knife hanging loosely in her hand. "Do you understand what you saw in my chamber this morning?" Patience couldn't speak, couldn't move. Terror had turned her body to stone. "I'm 42 years old," Eleanor continued, her voice taking on a strange, dreamy quality. "But I look 30, maybe younger. Do you know why? Do you know the secret to eternal youth, to beauty that never fades?" She reached out with her free hand and grabbed Patience's chin, forcing the girl to look at her. Her fingers were ice cold despite the warm morning air. "Blood, child. Fresh blood. Taken while the heart still beats, while the life force is strongest. I discovered it by accident years ago. A servant girl had cut herself badly in the kitchen. The blood got on my hands, and I noticed how my skin seemed to glow where it touched. I experimented, I researched, I learned, and I perfected the art." Patience found her voice at last, a broken whisper. "You killed them. All those servants who disappeared. Everyone said they ran away, but you killed them." "Not killed, harvested." Eleanor's smile was terrifying in its serenity. "There's a difference. I give them purpose. Their blood keeps me young, keeps me beautiful, keeps me powerful. Without me, what are they? Slaves destined for short, brutal lives in the fields. At least this way, they contribute to something greater. They become part of something that will last forever." "You're insane," Patience breathed. Eleanor's face hardened. "I'm a visionary. I've discovered the secret that queens and empresses have sought for centuries. I've beaten time itself, and you stupid girl, stumbled upon something you were never meant to see." The knife came up, catching the early morning light. Patience saw her death in that gleaming blade, saw the end of her short life played out in an instant. But something else rose up inside her then, something stronger than fear. It was rage, rage at a system that said some people could own other people, rage at a world where a wealthy white woman could murder with impunity while those she killed were considered property, not persons, rage at the injustice of it all. The small, dull knife Sarah had given her was still clutched in Patience's hand. She had forgotten about it in her terror, but now her fingers tightened around its worn handle. As Eleanor raised her blade, Patience moved. She wasn't fast, wasn't skilled, but she was desperate. She drove the small knife upward with all her strength, and by some miracle it found its mark. The blade sank into Eleanor's side, just below her ribs. It wasn't deep, the dull edge preventing it from penetrating far, but it was enough. Eleanor screamed, a sound of surprise and pain, and stumbled backward. Her own knife clattered to the floor as she pressed her hand to her side, blood seeping through her fingers. Patience didn't wait. She scrambled past Eleanor, out of the shed, and ran. Behind her she could hear Eleanor screaming for help, calling for her men. The woods erupted with shouts and the renewed baying of dogs. But Patience had a head start now, and fear gave her speed she didn't know she possessed. She ran until her lungs burned, until her legs threatened to give out beneath her. The stream was somewhere to her left now, and she could hear it getting louder, which meant it was widening, deepening. If she could just reach the main river, if she could find a way across, she might have a chance. The trees thinned ahead, and suddenly she burst out onto a dirt road. A road meant people, meant civilization. It also meant danger. Any white person who saw her, disheveled and bleeding and clearly a runaway slave, would be obligated to return her or face legal consequences themselves. But she had no choice. She turned and ran down the road, praying to a God she wasn't sure listened to the prayers of people like her. The sound of a wagon made her freeze. Coming around the bend was a weathered wooden cart pulled by a single horse. At the reins sat an older black man, his hair white with age, his face lined with years of hard labor. He was alone. When he saw Patience, his eyes widened, and she knew he understood immediately what she was running from. "Please," she gasped, barely able to speak. "Please help me." The man looked at her for a long moment, and in his eyes she saw the same calculation everyone in his position would make. Helping her could mean his death, but leaving her meant hers. Behind them both, the sounds of pursuit were growing louder. "Get in the back," he said finally, his voice rough with age and emotion. "Under the sacks, don't make a sound, no matter what you hear." Patience scrambled into the back of the wagon, and the man quickly piled rough burlap sacks over her, the smell of grain and earth filling her nostrils. The wagon lurched into motion, and through the gaps in the sacks, Patience could see daylight, could hear the steady clip-clop of the horses' hooves on the packed dirt road. They hadn't gone far when she heard horses approaching fast. The wagon came to a stop. "You there, old man!" It was Malcolm Briggs's voice, harsh and accusatory. "You seen a girl come this way? Young, light-skinned, wearing a house dress?" "No, sir, Mr. Briggs," the old man replied, his voice carefully neutral. "I ain't seen nobody since I left town this morning. Just me and old Bessie here, hauling grain back to the Miller place." "We got dogs saying different. They tracked her right to this road." "Well, sir, you know dogs can be wrong sometimes. Lose the scent, get confused. This here grain I'm hauling got a strong smell. Might have thrown them off." There was a long, tense silence. Patience held her breath, not daring to move, barely daring to breathe. She could feel the sacks being shifted, rough hands moving them aside. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the moment she would be discovered, for the moment it would all be over. But then Eleanor's voice cut through the morning air, shrill with pain and rage. "Find her, damn you! She can't have gotten far. She stabbed me. Search every wagon, every house, every barn within 10 miles. The sacks were dropped back onto Patience with more force than necessary, and she heard the horses wheeling around, galloping off in another direction. The wagon began moving again, faster now, the old man urging his horse to a trot despite the weight of the grain. They travelled for what felt like hours. Patience lost track of time under the sacks, the heat and the smell and the fear all combining to make her feel sick and dizzy. When the wagon finally stopped and the sacks were pulled away, she found herself in front of a small, modest house set back from the road. surrounded by trees that provided shelter from prying eyes. The old man helped her down, his grip surprisingly strong. "This is as far as I can take you safely," he said. "But the people in this house, they're part of the network. They'll help you get further north. You can't stay in Georgia, child. You know that, don't you?" Patience nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Why did you help me? You could have died." The old man's face softened. "Because somebody helped me once, a long time ago. Because we got to look out for each other, or we ain't got nothing. Because that woman you're running from, she's evil in a way that goes beyond just being a slave owner. I heard the rumors about the Blackwood estate, about servants who disappear. Most folks don't want to believe it, but I do, and if I can help take one person away from her, then maybe I've done something right in this world." The door of the house opened, and a middle-aged white woman emerged, her face kind but cautious. She took one look at Patience and ushered her inside quickly. The old man tipped his hat and climbed back onto his wagon, disappearing down the road without another word, risking his life for someone he'd never met before and would never see again. Inside the house, Patience found sanctuary, at least for the moment. The woman, who gave her name only as Mary, tended to her wounds, fed her, and explained the reality of her situation. Slave catchers would be looking for her everywhere. Eleanor Blackwood had money and influence, and she wouldn't stop until Patience was found or confirmed dead. The only real safety lay in the north, in the states where slavery had been abolished, but that was hundreds of miles away through hostile territory. "There's a network," Mary explained in a low voice, as if even in her own home she feared being overheard. "People like me, who believe that owning another human being is an abomination before God. We help people like you get to freedom. It's dangerous, illegal, and if we're caught, we face prison or worse. But it's the right thing to do." Over the next 3 days, Patience stayed hidden in a secret room beneath Mary's house, a space accessed through a concealed door in the kitchen floor. She could hear life going on above her, normal daily activities, and once the sound of men's voices asking about runaways. Mary's calm, measured lies sent them away, but Patience knew it was only a matter of time before someone became suspicious. On the 4th night, Mary came for her. "We're moving you tonight," she whispered. "There's a boat leaving from the river, taking goods north to Tennessee. You'll be hidden among the cargo. From there, another contact will take you further. You'll have to be patient, and you'll have to trust people you don't know. Can you do that?" Patience nodded. She had no choice. Freedom, the very concept that white people took for granted, that they built their nation upon, was denied to her by the color of her skin. But she would reach for it anyway. She would fight for it, risk everything for it, because the alternative was a death sentence at the hands of a madwoman who bathed in the blood of people she considered property. The journey north was a nightmare of hiding and fear, of close calls and narrow escapes. Patience traveled hidden in wagons, concealed in false-bottom boats, tucked into secret rooms in houses whose owners she never saw. She was passed from stranger to stranger, each one risking their life to help her, each one part of a network built on the fundamental belief that freedom was a right, not a privilege granted by birth or skin color. Months passed. Summer turned to autumn, autumn to winter. Patience made it to Tennessee, then to Kentucky, always moving north, always running from the shadow of Eleanor Blackwood. The story of what she had seen, what she had escaped from, traveled with her, whispered among the network. Some believed it, others thought it exaggerated, but all agreed that Eleanor Blackwood was dangerous, that the Blackwood estate was a place of horrors. Meanwhile, back in Black Hollow, Georgia, things were changing. Patience's disappearance and the violent circumstances surrounding it had stirred something in the slave quarters of the Blackwood estate. For the first time, people began to talk openly about the missing servants, about the screams from the 3rd floor, about the mistress who seemed never to age. The fear that had kept them silent began to transform into something else, something like courage. Mama Ruth, who had helped patients escape, knew her own time was limited. Eleanor Blackwood was not a woman who forgave or forgot, but she also knew that she was old, that she had lived longer than most in her position ever did, and that if she was going to die anyway, she might as well die doing something meaningful. She began to gather the others, the house servants who had seen too much, who knew the truth but had been too afraid to speak it. In whispered conversations in the early morning hours, in quick exchanges while working, in desperate meetings in the dark of night, they began to plan. Not an escape. They knew that was impossible for all of them, but something else, something that would expose Eleanor Blackwood for what she truly was. It was a young man named Joseph, who worked in the stables, who came up with the plan. "White folks won't listen to us," he said, "but they'll listen to each other. We need to get one of them to see what we've seen." They chose their target carefully. Dr. Edmund Hartley was the town physician, a man known for his integrity and his belief in evidence over rumor. He had attended Thomas Blackwood in his final hours, had signed the death certificate ruling it an accident, but Mama Ruth had seen the doubt in his eyes even then, had watched him examine the body with more care than seemed necessary for a simple riding accident. Getting the doctor to the house was easy. Eleanor still maintained the pretense of society, still hosted gatherings and attended church. When she began complaining of headaches, of mysterious ailments, it was only natural to summon the physician. What wasn't natural was what they had planned to show him. Dr. Hartley arrived on a cold December evening, his medical bag in hand, his face showing concern for his patient. Eleanor received him in the drawing room, the picture of a suffering but gracious hostess. She described her symptoms with convincing detail: the headaches, the fatigue, the general malaise. "I should examine you properly, Mrs. Blackwood," Dr. Hartley said. "In your private chambers, if you please. I'll need proper light and privacy to conduct a thorough examination." Eleanor's face flickered with something, annoyance perhaps, or calculation, but she couldn't refuse without seeming suspicious. She led him upstairs, to the third floor, to the chambers where she conducted her horrific rituals. Mama Ruth, following behind with fresh linens as was her duty, watched and waited. Dr. Hartley conducted his examination in the sitting room, adjoining Eleanor's bedroom, but his eyes kept straying to the locked door of the inner chamber. "What's in there?" he asked, his tone professionally curious. "My bathing room," Eleanor replied, her voice tight. "And my private sanctuary. Surely a lady is entitled to her privacy, Doctor." "Of course," he agreed, but there was something in his expression that hadn't been there before. Suspicion, perhaps, or a growing unease. It was Mama Ruth who made it happen. As she placed the linens on a nearby table, she accidentally knocked over the ring of keys that Eleanor had carelessly left on a side table. The keys clattered to the floor, and in the confusion of picking them up, Mama Ruth managed to slip one free, the large iron key that she knew opened the inner chamber door. That night, after Eleanor had retired and the house had settled into uneasy sleep, Mama Ruth used that key. She opened the door to the inner chamber and arranged things so that what needed to be seen would be seen. She didn't remove anything, didn't disturb more than necessary. She simply made sure that when light hit the room, the truth would be undeniable. The next morning, Mama Ruth claimed to have seen smoke coming from under the door of the inner chamber. It was a reasonable lie, and it created the emergency needed to justify breaking down a locked door. Dr. Hartley, who had stayed overnight to monitor his patient, was the one who forced the door open, with the overseer and several other white witnesses present. What they found inside stopped them all in their tracks. The room was a temple to vanity and madness, its walls lined with mirrors that multiplied the horror at its center. The large copper bathtub still held the residue of its last use, dark stains that could be nothing but blood. Arranged around the room were instruments, medical tools, knives of various sizes, and journals. Dozens of journals, filled with Eleanor's neat handwriting, documenting years of experiments, of discoveries, of murders justified as necessary sacrifices for her pursuit of eternal youth. On a table near the window lay items that made even hardened men gasp. Glass vials filled with dark liquid, preserved organs in jars, and a collection of personal items, trinkets that had belonged to servants who had mysteriously run away over the years. A child's doll, a man's pocket watch, a woman's hair ribbon, each one a life extinguished, each one a soul harvested for Eleanor's insane quest. Dr. Hartley, his face pale and his hands shaking, began to read from one of the journals. His voice trembled as he spoke the words Eleanor had written, clinical descriptions of her methods, of how she would drug her victims, bleed them slowly to keep the blood fresh, of how she would bathe in their life essence while they died. The dates went back years, coinciding with the disappearances of dozens of servants. "Good God," one of the men whispered. "She's a monster." Eleanor was arrested that same day. The scandal that erupted was unprecedented in Burke County history. A wealthy white woman, a pillar of society, revealed as a serial murderer who had killed her own slaves for years, driven by an insane belief in the rejuvenating properties of human blood. The story spread like wildfire, carried by newspapers throughout Georgia and beyond. Her trial was a spectacle. For the first time in the South's history, enslaved people were allowed to testify against a white person in a criminal case. The precedent was extraordinary, driven by the overwhelming physical evidence and the undeniable proof of Eleanor's guilt. Mama Ruth took the stand, her voice steady despite her fear, and told everything she had witnessed over the years. Other servants followed, their testimonies painting a picture of systematic horror that shocked even the most hardened observers. Eleanor Blackwood was found guilty of murder, multiple counts of murder, in a courthouse filled to capacity with people standing in the aisles and pressing against the windows. The judge pronounced her sentence: death by hanging. She was executed on a cold January morning in 1830. The entire town turned out to watch, along with hundreds of people from surrounding counties who had traveled to witness justice being done to someone who had considered herself above the law. As Eleanor stood on the gallows, her beauty had already begun to fade without her horrific treatments. Her skin had taken on a grayish cast, her hair had dulled, and the lines on her face seemed to have appeared overnight. In her final moments, she showed no remorse, no recognition of the enormity of her crimes. Instead, she railed against the crowd, against the system that was executing her, against the slaves whose testimonies had condemned her. "I was doing what nature demands," she screamed as the noose was placed around her neck. "The strong must consume the weak. That is the law of the world." The trapdoor opened, and Eleanor Blackwood fell to her death. But even in death, she continued to cast a shadow over Black Hollow and the wider conversation about slavery in America, because the trial had revealed something that many in the South wanted desperately to ignore. It had shown that when you treat human beings as property, when you grant one person absolute power over another, when you build a system that denies fundamental humanity to an entire race of people, you create the conditions for unimaginable evil. Eleanor Blackwood was an extreme case, a monster among monsters, but the system that had enabled her crimes was itself monstrous. The enslaved people who had testified against her had shown courage and dignity in the face of a system designed to strip them of both. They had stood in a courthouse and demanded to be seen as human beings, as witnesses to truth, as people whose lives and testimony mattered. And for a brief moment, the system had been forced to acknowledge them. But change came slowly, agonizingly slowly. The Blackwood estate was sold, its slaves dispersed to other plantations. Mama Ruth was granted her freedom as a reward for her role in exposing Eleanor's crimes, one of the only slaves in Georgia to be manumitted in 1830. She lived another 15 years, spending her time helping other escaped slaves reach freedom, her courage never wavering. As for Patience, she finally reached free soil in early 1830, settling in a small community of free black people in Pennsylvania. She learned to read and write, married a carpenter named Jacob, and raised 3 children who never knew the chains their mother had escaped. She never forgot what she had seen in that bathroom, never forgot the price of the freedom she now possessed. And in her later years, she became a speaker for the abolitionist cause, telling her story to crowds who sometimes believed and sometimes didn't, but who couldn't deny the intensity and conviction in her voice. "Freedom is not free," she would tell them. "It is bought with blood and courage, with sacrifice and determination." The blood Eleanor Blackwood spilled was meant to serve her vanity, but in the end it served truth instead. It revealed the horror at the heart of slavery, the way absolute power corrupts absolutely, the way treating people as property leads to treating them as things, as resources to be used and discarded. The Blackwood estate stood empty for years after Eleanor's execution. No one wanted to buy it, despite the quality of its land and the grandeur of its house. Local people said it was haunted, cursed, stained by the blood of innocents. Eventually, it fell into ruin, its columns cracking, its roof caving in, its walls covered in vines and moss. The building became a monument to the horrors it had housed, a reminder that evil can wear the face of beauty and respectability, that monsters can hide behind wealth and social position. In the slave quarters, though, even decades later, old people would tell stories to the young. Stories about the widow who bathed in blood, about the girl who escaped her grasp, about the courage it took to stand up to evil, even when the law said you had no right to stand at all. These stories became part of the oral history of Black Hollow, passed down through generations, a reminder that freedom must be fought for, that silence in the face of evil is complicity, that every person has the right to be seen as human, regardless of the color of their skin. Dr. Edmund Hartley never fully recovered from what he saw in that inner chamber. He continued to practice medicine, but he became increasingly vocal in his opposition to slavery, arguing that a system that could produce someone like Eleanor Blackwood was fundamentally corrupt. His medical practice suffered as a result, as many of his wealthy patients found his new political views distasteful. But he never regretted his role in bringing Eleanor to justice, never regretted opening that door and exposing the truth. The journals that Eleanor had kept, those meticulous records of her crimes, were entered into evidence during her trial and then sealed by court order. They remained sealed for decades, considered too disturbing for public consumption. But historians who were eventually granted access to them found more than just descriptions of murder. They found a window into a mind that had been warped by the absolute power that slavery granted to slave owners. Eleanor's descent into madness hadn't been sudden. It had been gradual, a slow corruption that began with smaller cruelties and escalated over time, enabled by a system that gave her unchecked authority over the lives of hundreds of people. Some of her early journal entries were almost sympathetic in their ordinariness. A young bride, uncomfortable with the power she suddenly possessed. A woman trying to navigate the social expectations of plantation life. But as the years progressed, as she grew accustomed to being obeyed without question, as she internalized the idea that the people who served her were less than human, something broke inside her. The pursuit of eternal youth began as vanity, but it became an obsession and then a justification for atrocity. One entry, written just weeks before Patience's escape, read, "They are resources, nothing more. The Bible itself condones our ownership of them. If they have souls, they are not souls like ours. To use them for my purposes is no different than slaughtering a cow for meat or shearing a sheep for wool. They exist to serve, and I have found a way for them to serve me better than any fieldwork or household duty could achieve. I am making myself immortal, and they are the tools by which I achieve that immortality. Surely that is purpose enough for any creature. These words, and hundreds more like them, revealed how completely Eleanor had dehumanized the people in her power. The system of slavery had given her that power, and her own twisted psychology had determined how she used it. But the system itself was the enabler, the foundation upon which her house of horrors had been built. The scandal of the Blackwood case became a rallying cry for abolitionists in the North and a source of defensive outrage in the South. Southern newspapers argued that Eleanor was an aberration, that her crimes were the result of individual madness rather than systemic evil. Northern papers countered that she was the logical endpoint of a system built on the ownership of human beings, that absolute power would always lead to absolute corruption. The debate raged for years, became part of the larger conversation about slavery that would eventually tear the nation apart in civil war. And through it all, the image of Eleanor Blackwood in her blood-filled bathtub remained a powerful, disturbing symbol of what human beings become when they are granted power without accountability, when they are taught that some lives matter less than others, when the pursuit of personal benefit is allowed to override basic human morality. In Black Hollow itself, the memory of the scandal never faded. Generation after generation, people would walk past the ruins of the Blackwood estate and remember. They would tell the story to their children, and their children would tell it to their children. And the story would change and evolve, but never lose its essential truth. That once, in this place, a woman bathed in the blood of innocence. That once, in this place, people who were called property found the courage to speak truth. That once, in this place, the illusion of respectability was stripped away to reveal the horror underneath. The story became a ghost story, a cautionary tale, a piece of folklore. But it was also real, documented in court records and newspapers, in testimonies that could not be denied. The tension between myth and reality, between the fictionalized version people told in whispers and the stark documentary evidence, made the story more powerful, not less. And at the heart of it all was a simple truth that resonated across decades and centuries. Freedom matters. Human dignity matters. The right to be seen as a person, rather than property, matters more than any law or custom or economic system that says otherwise. Eleanor Blackwood had tried to steal the very essence of the people she owned, to literally consume their lives to extend her own. But in the end, it was their humanity, their courage, their insistence on being seen and heard that had brought her down. Patience lived to be 73 years old, dying peacefully in her sleep, in the house she and Jacob had built with their own hands. Her children were free, had always been free, had grown up in a world where they were citizens rather than property. They never fully understood what their mother had survived, couldn't quite grasp the magnitude of courage it had taken for a 16-year-old girl to run through the darkness with dogs at her heels and death waiting in every shadow. But they honored her memory, told her story, made sure that the price she had paid for their freedom was never forgotten. On Patience's gravestone, placed in a small cemetery in Pennsylvania, her children had inscribed a simple epitaph. She ran toward freedom when others said it was impossible. She spoke truth when others said she had no voice. She lived as a testimony that all human beings are created equal. Back in Georgia, the ruins of the Blackwood estate eventually collapsed entirely, returning to the earth from which they had been built. Where the grand house once stood, only a depression in the ground remained, marked by fragments of broken marble and twisted iron. The land itself seemed cursed. Nothing would grow properly there, and even the most desperate farmers avoided it. But in the end, it wasn't the house or the land that mattered. It was the story. The story of Eleanor Blackwood, the widow who bathed in blood. The story of Patience, the girl who escaped and lived to tell the tale. The story of Mama Ruth and all the others who risked everything to expose evil. The story of a system that treated people as property and the inevitable horrors that system produced. It was a story about freedom, about what freedom costs and why it matters. About how the fight for liberty and human dignity is never truly over, because there will always be those who seek to subjugate others, who convince themselves that some people matter less, who build elaborate justifications for cruelty and exploitation. And there will always be those who resist, who insist on their humanity even when the world tries to deny it, who risk everything for the simple right to be free. The scandal that stained Georgia in 1829 became part of the larger story of America, a nation founded on ideals of freedom while building an economy on slavery, a contradiction that would eventually require a war to resolve. Eleanor Blackwood was just one monster among many, but her story illuminated the fundamental truth that the abolitionist movement had been trying to communicate all along, that you cannot own another human being without consequences, that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. In the end, the blood that Eleanor spilled in her pursuit of eternal beauty became the stain that could never be washed away, from the land she owned, from the town she had been part of, from the system that had enabled her crimes. Her name became synonymous with the darkest possibilities of human nature, with what people become when they are given unchecked authority over others, when they are taught that some lives are valuable and others are expendable. And generations later, when people spoke of freedom and what it meant, when they talked about the price that had been paid for liberty, when they discussed the long, painful road toward recognizing the equal humanity of all people, they would sometimes tell the story of the widow of Black Hollow, the woman who thought she could live forever by stealing the lives of others, the woman who learned too late that the only thing eternal about her would be the memory of her crimes. The story lived on, a dark chapter in American history, a reminder that the fight for freedom and human dignity is never truly won, only fought again and again by each new generation. And at its heart was always the same message, that every human being has the right to be free, to be seen as fully human, to be safe from those who would use their power to do harm, that some truths are worth dying for, and some horrors must be exposed no matter the cost. The widow of Black Hollow bathed in blood, but the stain she left was not the one she intended. It was not youth or beauty or immortality. It was a mark of evil that time could not erase, a warning written in the lives she destroyed, a testament to the absolute necessity of freedom and the absolute horror of its denial.